Seoul and Beijing have agreed to work swiftly to get their relations back on track, following a year-long standoff over the deployment of a U.S. anti-missile system in South Korea. How will improved relations influence the region? Leaders from China and South Korea are set to hold talks next week on the sidelines of the APEC summit. What issues will top their agenda? The thaw between China and South Korea comes just ahead of the U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to Asia, where he will be visiting both countries as well as Japan. How should we understand this particular timing? Is U.S. leadership receding both in Asia and on the global stage? What does this mean for China? Will China replace the U.S. as the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific?
China and South Korea are seeking to push the reset button in their relations following months of a tense situation triggered by the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system. Hopes have been growing for a thaw in the frosty bilateral ties following China's just concluded Party Congress, as well as Donald Trump embarking on his very first Asia trip. How should we understand the timing of this? What are the implications for regional geopolitics? Will Trump present a clear and coherent statement of the U.S. commitment to the region, or a confused and uncertain assessment? To discuss these issues and more today, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at China Institute of International Studies, Anna Tangen, author and columnist. We shall also talk to Professor In-Gyu Oh from Korea University via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yao Rui. Gentlemen, according to latest statement, both governments, the ROK and the PRC, agreed to strengthen their relationship and go back to normal, namely putting the relationship on track. Are you optimistic that despite the issue of a THAAD, the two governments are really determined to move ahead no matter what?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic because, number one, the major issue triggering the disputes has been diffused. But number two, on the other hand, the diffused issue remains there. And whether or not the two sides can completely solve this issue, we have to wait and see, and it will take time.
Well, his cautious optimism didn't answer my question directly and clearly. What's your response to his attitude of ambiguity?
Well, I'm going to agree with my colleague. I mean, everything depends on the situation and what happens and could happen in the next couple of weeks when Donald Trump comes here about what is the situation in North Korea, how the U.S. and China want to tackle it. Xi Jinping talked about creating a new blueprint for relationships. And unfortunately for South Korea, they're caught in the middle. Earlier this month, on October 4th, there was an announcement that Korea had acquiesced, had agreed to reset their KORUS, the Korean-U.S. trade agreement. But clearly, I don't think this is something that South Korea was very happy about. And I think they're looking to balance the situation. You know, this month alone, exports to China increased by 13%. Given the size of the relationship, that could give you some idea. There was a decrease, but from the U.S. side, but it was due to seasonal factors and anything else. But balancing these two things, I think, is absolutely essential. Knowing what's happening with North Korea is the other part.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Professor Oh for his analysis on the policy options of President Moon Jae-in. Here is an assumption, Professor Oh, that internally there's no sign that former President Park Geun-hye will be set free pending the investigation against her corruption allegations. And externally, this president, the newly elected one, seeks to go back to the normal state-to-state relationship despite the embarrassing dilemma on the future of THAAD deployment. What do you make of the dual-track discourse for the presidency of Moon Jae-in?
Well, he has always hoped for the reconciliation between China and South Korea before he had been even elected as president. Also, in addition to that, he always has hoped to restore peaceful relationship between North Korea and South Korea. So for him, this is a great breakthrough because China and South Korea are now agreeing to restore, at least normalize a little bit of their past relations. So this is a good timing for the president in South Korea.
How important is it for the South Korean economy to have a resumed normal relationship between Beijing and Seoul at this moment?
The South Korean economy as a whole has not been really impacted by the thaw fiasco over the years, but certainly the tourist industry and entertainment industries are very welcome about this new opening in the Chinese and South Korean relationship. So partially, yes, South Korea is very happy, especially tourism industries. But overall, there was not much difference in the economic relations between China and South Korea.
What commitments or promises has Beijing secured from our friends in Seoul about the deployment of THAAD? Because there might be more batteries to be deployed in the ROK given the upcoming threats from the DPRK on missile or nuclear tests.
I think DPRK's nuclear tests and missile threats will subside a little bit over the next couple of months, hoping that in the future, in the next year and on, North Korea will stop missile tests altogether. If those things happen in the near future, I think THAAD will be taken out of South Korea completely, because that's what President Moon is trying to achieve in the next couple of months.
Well, Professor Oh was a bit evasive on the issue of whether more batteries are to be deployed in the ROK, given the strong possibility that the unpredictable Kim Jong-un, leader of DPRK, is likely to conduct more missile and nuclear tests in the days ahead. What do you think should be the response from China? Do you think the bilateral relationship remains pretty fragile?
Remains in uncertain format because the decisive factor does not lie in the bilateral, but lies in the multilateral. Both China and South Korea are indeed sincerely making efforts to recover and develop further the bilateral relation. But during the course, another two external factors affecting the course. One is the United States, the other is North Korea. See, the United States, yes, Professor O is right. Say, if there's no North Korea missile and nuclear threats, and the THAAD will be gone. That's to my knowledge, that's many arguments by South Korean. But my question, Chinese concern or question is, U.S. used to make use of Iranian missile threats as an excuse or as a reason to deploy anti-missile system in Europe, in the middle, especially
in
middle.
Latvia and Poland.
Yeah, up to Russia. But the question is, let's suppose even without Iranian missile threats or Iranian missile threats gone, and then the national anti-missile system in Europe will be gone? No. So Chinese, by this logic, Chinese believe even without North Korea missile threats, even South Korean people say, oh, North Korean missile threats are gone, so the THAAD is gone. But the U.S. will say no. So that's one factor. The other factor is President Moon is obviously really want to improve relation with China, and THAAD is a single problem, damage the bilateral. But if the North Korea keep quiet, and that would be easy for President Moon to do what he wants. But if the story is the opposite, say on this side, South Korea make efforts to improve bilateral relations with China, but on the other hand, North Korea keep doing something like missile tests, then the deployment of the THAAD will be more complicated than Moon can manage.
I'd put it more simply. He's caught between this dilemma of looking like he's willing to defend his country very strongly and have what is necessary, and his need for trade. So these are the two polar opposites, and I agree. The framework is multilateral. It cannot be just something settled between China and South Korea. It has to be all four, U.S. and North Korea. The question is, and I think China could be in a position to say, look, you want our help with North Korea, that's fine. But if that's the case, if things go down to neutral, you have to remove these things. And there might even be some pressure to start removing, if things are settled, to start removing the troops.
What you guys have been dwelling upon seem to suggest that we are at the mercy of the whims of the DPRK regime and unpredictability of the presidency of Donald Trump. However, don't underestimate the political will and the strong leadership of Xi Jinping following the 19th National Congress of the CPC. We have entered into the new era of socialism with strong Chinese characteristics, and therefore let's look at what's going to happen at the upcoming summit on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Hanoi. What do you think will be the major issues? The DPRK would of course be prioritized on the agenda, right?
Absolutely, but I mean, what can China do? Let us be candid about this. China can attack, China can exert pressure. Everything, all the pressure that it's been brought to bear so far has not resulted in North Korea giving up their nuclear weapons. And I don't think that I would agree with Putin. They're never going to give them up because they see this as their own
strength. They would rather eat grass than giving up the nuclear program.
This is
That's
what
Putin said.
So I do think that it's not a question of resolve by China. It's a complex question. It's not a question of resolve by President Trump. It's a question of how you can get together, and I think the multilateral commitment is necessary. You cannot rule the world the way it was in the past, and all countries have to realize this. China and the U.S. need each other to settle these things.
See, the presidency of Donald Trump was won on the platform of populism. And part of that arose from the public sentiment that China has been able to enjoy a huge trade surplus over the past decade or so since the entry into the WTO. No matter what excuses they might have, it seems China has to make some concessions in upcoming negotiations of strategic and economic dialogue, and particularly on the sidelines of the APEC summit. What do you think will be done by the Chinese authorities to ease the tensions arising from the trade protectionism of the Trump administration?
Well, actually, you mentioned a very key word of this very big question, say, concession. If you say whether or not China or President Xi will make a concession when he meets with Donald Trump about trade, I will say absolutely no. No concession at all. Not because China is powerful or China is very tough, but because China's way of thinking lies in the win-win game rather than the zero-sum game. If China makes a concession, that means the game is a zero-sum game. So China opposes any type of a zero-sum game, no matter China will win or lose. So China's way of thinking to deal with the surplus issue is like a win-win game, like by making the pie bigger, rather than to reduce the size of China's part in the pie. So when I believe... Are
you suggesting that instead of having TPP, we're going to turn to RCEP to be more comprehensively responsible for the internal trade within the broad region of Asia-Pacific region?
Firstly, China will not oppose TPP, no matter U.S. take in or take out. And secondly, China will do dual-track efforts, multilateral and bilateral. Bilateral with the United States, we want to expand the total volume. Through this course, U.S.-China will rebalance the trade situation. And in the multilateral, that's more important because that is the macro environment for every country. So through the APEC, China will be more active to push forward the free trade and investment by making proposals, by calling for implementing what we have agreed by all countries.
Well, thank you very much. Let me go back to Professor Oh for his comments on the $56 billion worth of currency swap scheme between the ROK and China. Despite the tensions arising from the THAAD program during the reign of Park Geun-hye, who is now under investigation legally in your country, what's going to happen? What does that mean for the regional integration in Northeast Asia? Question number two, gentlemen, including the two guest speakers in the Beijing studio, what does that mean for internationalization of RMB? Because Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela perhaps, and even including some of the major oil-rich countries in the Gulf would love to use RMB in the settlement of their major business transactions. Let's first of all take a look at the currency swap scheme between our two economies in Northeast Asia. Professor Oh.
Yeah, this one clearly signals the fact that China is different from Japan in terms of currency swaps. South Korea had currency swap agreements with China on the one hand and with Japan on the other. But Japan, as you remember, declined to renew it this year, calling for the diplomatic problems with two countries. Nonetheless, China chose a different path. The path is that we uphold the agreements, currency swap agreements, meaning to the South Koreans that China is really different from the Japanese in dealing with South Korea. So this is a positive sign to many South Koreans who are worried about THAAD and currency swap. These are two separate issues, and the Chinese government is really doing a good job of making it separate. The two different issues. And that leads to the second question of yours, that is, renminbi will be probably much more stronger and reliable currency for at least Northeast Asia, and probably somewhere beyond Northeast Asia, like Southeast Asia, probably maybe in some Central Asian countries as well.
But I wonder if this major currency swap scheme would be accepted or win some kind of recognition from Tokyo after Shinzo Abe won the success in the lower house of parliamentary elections, strengthening the power base of LDP, particularly with the modest success of Abenomics in the past few years. We'll take a further look at prioritized issues on the agenda between Washington and Beijing when we come back after the short break. So stay with us. Welcome back. Xi Yu, what do you think of the top issues on the agenda between President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart at the upcoming summit on the sidelines of APEC?
In terms of the bilateral, I think basically one big issue, two hot issues. One big issue is the vision of the China-U.S. relation in the long term. And I think the two presidents will certainly discuss this issue, say the long-term shape of the bilateral relation, say make them in stable and peaceful coexistence and peaceful cooperation type. And two hot issues, obviously, North Korean issue is very urgent, and the trade issue, very important for both of the countries. And hopefully, I think in the trade issue, the two sides will make achievements, even make a breakthrough, because we have had a very good base for solving this complicated issue, because we have successfully implemented the so-called 100-day plan at the early stage of Donald Trump administration. And based on that achievement, I think the two sides will be able to make a greater efforts to have a greater plan by making the pie bigger.
And with the enormous campaign by the Chinese authorities to leveling the playing field for both Chinese homegrown enterprises and overseas multinationals in terms of the corporate income tax, to say nothing of other measures that have been taken by Beijing to create a more equal condition for all players in the Chinese market. President Trump has promised to adopt a new tax rate to attract American multinationals back home, create more jobs. In that case, do you think our bilateral economic relationship will get better or even worse?
Well, I don't think it's very smart for Donald Trump to be selling things that don't have any real substance. The fact is, American companies need to be competitive internationally. Remember, we're the second largest nation in terms of export of trade, over $2 trillion. You cannot do that if the base of your economic base is more expensive than somewhere else. I'm sorry. That's why there was this global supply chain, and that's why American companies got very rich in the period from 2001 onwards. So this idea that somehow by lessening the rates you're going to equalize things, it doesn't. A worker in the U.S. is going to cost more than a worker in Bangladesh or anywhere else in certain parts of China. China is climbing the value chain. Its wages are going up. Standard of living is going up. That is a definite fact. But concentrating on China is not going to solve the U.S.'s problems. These companies will just simply go elsewhere. If not China, Vietnam, you name it. There are many places where they can go and get cheap labor and do what they need to. In some cases, they want to avoid environmental liability for what they do. So I think this is a complete dead end, as they call a red herring. It does not matter. What is important, though, is, I agree with you, this long-term issue. You have a president in the United States who's completely deal-focused. The 100-day plan, it was a tit for tat. You do this, I do that, you do this. Is there any strategy to it?
But,
no.
You know, a professor from Fudan University said recently in an interview, look, most of the Chinese welcome President Trump because this is a guy free from ideological bias.
No,
he would love to have a transactional business thinking.
He's been good for China because he's caused so much uncertainty about where the U.S. is going. Business and diplomacy demand predictability. With Donald Trump, you have neither.
We are at a crossroad.
Yeah.
While you say let's transform the bilateral relationship into a bigger pie. What do you mean in this context?
Well, exactly speaking, the current state of the U.S.-China relation, just like a complex building or construction, containing both good part and bad part. You mentioned many of the bad parts. The current state of the bilateral relation is a great challenge to President Xi as well as to President Donald Trump. Say the strategic wisdom to manage the complexity of the bilateral relation.
You know, there's an old saying: battles are won by armies, wars are won by economies. Right now, China is the #1 economic relation with over 160 countries. The U.S. has retreated dramatically over the last 12 years. The fact is that the international of the yuan is marching ahead, whether it is wanted or not. You know, if you're Saudi Arabia and you're doing most of your business with China, why do you want to take a risk on having a dollar inserted in between? It is much easier to just do trade directly. So this is happening. The question is, how will the U.S. react to this fact that it is in this multipolar world? As you said, it's very complex. The reason it's complex is the U.S. is fighting it. They keep trying to go back, that we can somehow go back to the days when we could demand or force people to do exactly what we want. It doesn't matter. It's not just the U.S. and China. As I said, the majority of countries in the world are dealing with China as their #1 trade partner. That is not something the U.S. can change.
Let me humbly correct your conventional thinking. The battles are won by generals and wars by economists. In fact, Eric Lee, a red capitalist from Shanghai, was pouring scorns on the prestige of Economist, one prestigious journal on the Chinese economic performance. For years, this economy got a bad reputation for its poor judgment on the Chinese economy. Let me go back to Professor Oh from ROK for his analysis on economic dynamics in Northeast Asia. Certainly, trade protectionism will be one of the major issues for President Trump and his Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of the APEC summit. What does a healthy economic development between the biggest and the second biggest economy mean for the ROK?
Well, it means a lot to South Korea, which hinges on the success of open door policies and free trade regimes in both America and China. Of course, Donald Trump hasn't done anything tremendously bad to the South Korean economy. We're certainly worried about his foreseeable move toward protectionism on the one end, but On the other, we're more worried about Chinese open door policy and free trade regime because we haven't had really established a bilateral free trade regime on a full scale because of obviously because of political hiccups here and there, because of possibly because of multilateral, relational breakdowns, because of North Korea and because of Japan, because of United States sometimes. So South Korea is really hoping for a free trade regime in full scale. Probably in China as well. Probably more in China than in the United States at this moment because we are the #1 trade partner in the world, I think, from the South Korean point of view. So the world is very uncertain at the moment for South Korea. The only hope is to gain access to new markets as much as possible for South Koreans, but there are not few markets available at the moment. So the surest thing for now for South Korea is to gain access to probably the largest economy in Asia, that's China.
Well, with the dynamics in reconciling our relationship with the ROK, perhaps we'll go back to the FTA norm, which was first adopted by President Park Geun-hye. Do you think this has been the envy for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who sent his special envoy to Peking, hat in hand, asking for an opportunity of hosting a summit meeting, perhaps in Peking or in Tokyo, in most likelihood, if this were to happen, maybe President Xi Jinping will make some concessions on the issue of history. How do you foresee the further regional integration economically between the three major economies in Northeast Asia?
It is the WTO and APEC that has already established some sort of integration between three big markets here. The real problem is political instead of economics. So I would say the war has to be fought between politicians first to figure out what the economists can take over and gain some profits out of that. The war has never been fought really since the end of the Korean War, so there will be no role really in the military in the game. I think to me it's more of a political game right now, and all these trade agreements, treaties, and all these agreements don't seem to work in Northeast Asia, especially because of the seriousness of political problems here.
Thank you so much, Professor Oh, for being with us. Very quickly, before we conclude this discussion on dialogue, what do you think of the impact of a FTA that was inked during the administration of Park Geun-hye? What does that mean for Japan?
Well, there have been a plan among China, Japan, South Korea for FTA in trilateral. But compared with the China, South Korea, with Japan, relatively Japan is more reluctant or less active towards the FTA. And
are you suggesting they prefer to have TPP instead of FTA between the two major economies?
Yes, and also because of the political obstacles, the trilateral is very hard to move forward. But hopefully, #1, by the end of this year, the three countries will be able to restore the trilateral summit. That will input a new momentum for the deadlocked program.
And your take, very quickly.
I think it's Belt and Road Initiative. If China is able to actually make these physical connections to these things, these are exactly the kind of markets that both Japan and Korea want, so they'll join in.
But as the very first step in the right direction, I'm afraid Shinzo Abe has to figure out whether they're going to join the AIIB to deliver a positive and promising message to Beijing. With that, we'll come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on the Future of Northeast Asia. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.